Good evening, dear friends. My name is David Myers. I am the president and CEO of the Center for Jewish History, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this evening's program. The Center for Jewish History, as some of you may know, is one of the world's greatest repositories of archival material relating to Jewish history. There are, in this building, we estimate, somewhere on the order of 100 million historical documents, which have been assiduously collected and cultivated by our 5 partner organizations: the American Jewish Historical Society, the American Sephardi Federation, the Leo Baeck Institute, the Yeshiva University Museum, and the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research. Those 5 organizations and their collections really span the entire Jewish world. And what one finds in our archival collections really is a reflection of the Jewish historical experience over time and space. So we are, in the first instance, a mecca of research and scholarship, a place that attracts the leading researchers in the field of Jewish history from throughout the world to this very building on 16th Street, West 16th Street in Chelsea. But we're much more than an archive. We're also a museum that features exhibitions on a wide range of topics and themes, and we are a cultural center which has an active array of public programs, open and accessible to everyone. And in fact, it is in that role that we are delighted to inaugurate a series of new programs in this season of renewal, shall we say. It's a bit cold for that, but nonetheless, we feel the time is right to renew what we do and really bring to life an important principle, which is that historical knowledge and perspective should not be consigned only to the archive. It should be brought into the public. Historical perspective and depth should be part of informed engagement in society. History should be brought alive. The past needs to illumine the present. And that really is our mission, and that's what we hope to do in our public program series. I don't know if any of you were here last night when we inaugurated our very short introduction series. Next Tuesday night, we begin our History Matters series, where we bring historians of renown to reflect on their work and how it speaks to the present. Next Tuesday night, we'll have Professor Deborah Lipstadt in this very auditorium, and I encourage you all to come to that. But tonight, we're delighted to inaugurate another new series called First Person: Jewish Stories, Jewish Lives. And its aim is to bring to the center renowned figures who reflect on their own Jewish histories in a very personal way. And we're really delighted to have with us an outstanding writer, Tova Mirvis, whose brilliant first novel, The Ladies' Auxiliary, is one that I regard with wonder and really astonishment to this very day. She will be in conversation with another brilliant writer, Marjorie Ingall, and we hope that you will come to future programs in this series, as well as the many public events that the center sponsors as part of this mission to bring historical perspective and knowledge to as wide a public as possible. Now, we do this wide array of activities only because we have wonderful partners out there in the community. And it's really only through those partnerships that this institution exists. If you haven't had a chance to join the Center for Jewish History, I encourage you to pick up one of these forms and fill it out. You can sort of drop your pen down to the lower rung of the giving level if you feel so inclined. And if you are interested in sponsoring a program such as this, we're always looking for partners in that regard, and please seek me out after tonight's program. I have only one more task left, and that is to bring to the stage our really wondrous and inventive new Director of Public Programming, Judy Greenspan. Judy.
Okay, so, good. So it's very nice to see all of you here tonight, and I want to welcome you on behalf of the Center and the American Jewish Historical Society and the Jewish Book Council, who co-partnered with us to bring Tova and Marjorie here tonight. So as David said, this new series, First Person, Jewish Stories, Jewish Lives, really seeks to share personal stories that illuminate the Jewish experience, both past, present, and future. And we are delighted, as he said, to have two really master storytellers here with us tonight, Tova Mirvis and Marjorie Ingall, in conversation about Tova's recently published memoir, The Book of Separation. So just a little bit of background before they get started. As many of you know, Tova grew up in the Orthodox community of Memphis, Tennessee, the setting of her first novel, The Ladies' Auxiliary, which she wrote when she was only 26, or was published when she was only 26 years old. And just a show of hands, how many people have read The Ladies? Okay, I thought so. So then you all know that it is a fascinating, funny, and actually quite emotional story about what happened when a free-spirited young woman moved into the close-knit and somewhat closed Orthodox community in Memphis. The book was a national bestseller when it was published in 1999, and because we're here talking about stories, I just want to read to you how it started. So, quote, "Bathsheba appeared in our lives on a Friday afternoon as we were getting ready for Shabbos. It was inappropriate that she moved in when she did. Not that there was any religious prohibition against it, but it wasn't something we would have done. Fridays were set aside to prepare for Shabbos, and on the day Bathsheba arrived, we were picking up our children from day camp, frying up chickens, and doing laundry, the list of last-minute tasks growing as sundown approached. Even in the summer, when Shabbos started close to 8 o'clock, there was never enough time to get ready." So I remember reading that, and I was hooked. I didn't stop reading the book till I finished it. The New York Times called The Ladies' Auxiliary full of verve and chutzpah, where Southern flavors meet Jewish sensibilities. And USA Today said Mirvis has written a book that poses poignant questions, even as it acknowledges that there may be no answers to them. Tova went on to write two more novels of wide acclaim, The Outside World, also set in the Orthodox community, and Visible City. At the same time, she was married, raising 3 children, and living in the modern Orthodox communities, first on the Upper West Side of New York, and then in Newton, Massachusetts. But as her beautiful new memoir reveals, she was increasingly asking poignant questions about her own life during these years, heart-wrenching questions that led to life-changing answers. There are many, many reviews of Tova's work, but one I particularly liked because it gets at the essence of what it means to be a storyteller of her caliber. While she tells specific and personal stories in her novels and memoir, each one rooted in the Jewish world, the questions she grapples with, the dilemmas she explores and exposes are utterly relatable. So as the Seattle Times noted, you don't have to be Jewish to love her. So joining Tova tonight is another wonderful writer familiar to many here. Marjorie Ingall is the recent author of Mamala Knows Best, What Jewish Mothers Do to Raise Successful, Creative, Empathetic, Independent Children. And she's also the insightful, witty, and often very funny columnist, in fact, almost always very funny columnist for Tablet magazine. Marjorie's columns reveal a writer with a wide range of interests and intriguing, highly clickable headlines like What Pixar Movies Can Teach Us About Death and Loss, the 4 children's books you absolutely shouldn't buy for Hanukkah, and 10 things I've learned after 2 bat mitzvahs, of which I will share with you right now. Point 10, party favors are Satan's carnival prizes. No one will remember them. Do not stress about where to buy monogrammed earbuds or your child's face as a cookie. So, having been through 2 bat mitzvahs myself, I have to relate to that. So tonight, we're going to bring up Tova and Marjorie in just a minute. Our program begins with Tova introducing and reading from her new book, Book of Separation, followed by a conversation with Marjorie Ingall. We'll also have a question and answer period at the end of the program, and you all should have received little note cards. So you can write down your questions on those note cards. I'll collect them shortly before they're done talking and hand them to Marjorie, and she will then ask Tova questions at the end. And after the program, we hope that you'll join us in the Great Hall for a reception and book signing. So now I'd like to introduce Tova Mirvis and Marjorie Ingall.
Hi, thank you all so much for coming. It's so nice to be here, to be in New York tonight with you. So I'm going to read a little bit from the Book of Separation, and I'm looking forward to having a conversation with all of you. The Book of Separation really began for me with an essay I wrote a number of years ago. The essay was about my Orthodox Jewish divorce ceremony, in which I came to realize that I was leaving not just a marriage, but the religious world that had shaped me. And the essay was published in the New York Times, and before writing the essay and sending it off to be published, I really struggled with what it meant to write my own personal story and to put it out in a public venue. Certainly as a fiction writer, I'm always used to that game of it is me and it's not me. And I decided that it was a story that I wanted to tell publicly, although with a lot of trepidation. And it just happened that when the essay was published, I happened to be on a hiking trip in a very remote region of Costa Rica. And so I think if I've learned anything as a writer, it's that when you put your most private, personal story in the New York Times, a rainforest with no email reception is really the best place to be. I cannot recommend it highly enough. And when I came back, though, from this trip, I found really to my surprise and to really in a very emotional way, discovered that I had hundreds of emails waiting for me. And some were from family and friends, but really the overwhelming majority were from strangers, from men and women, old and young, of all religious backgrounds, writing to share their stories with me. And some were stories about divorce, and some were stories about religious grappling, but they were really all stories of change of one kind or another. And it was the most moving experience I've had as a writer. It reminded me of why I want to write in the first place. That sense that you can tell your own personal story, your own private moment, and other people relate to it and find themselves in it, even when it cuts across great distances. And as I just grappled with whether I was going to write a memoir, I think I often came back to this experience of receiving these emails and wanted to think about how to tell not just my own private story, but the larger questions that I thought could emerge from it. Questions about leave-taking, about the separations we all forge of one kind or another, about what it means to grapple with doubt and belief, about the relationship between belonging and believing, about deciding to listen to an internal voice instead of an external set of rules. And so those are really the animating questions that I thought about as I wrote this book. So I'm going to read to you a little bit from the Book of Separation, from near the start of the book. And it's from the first chapter, which is called New Year, New You. It is September, the first Rosh Hashanah since the divorce, and I've set out on my own. My 3 children are with their father at his parents' house, where I'd spent the past decade of these holidays. My parents, sister, and grandparents are at home in Memphis, where they will observe this celebration of the Jewish New Year in the Orthodox synagogue I attended every week of my childhood. My brother, along with 4 of his 8 children, has traveled with throngs of fellow Breslover Hasidim, an ultra-Orthodox sect, to Uman, a city in Ukraine, the site of their spiritual pilgrimage. And I am fleeing to Kripalu, a yoga and meditation retreat in western Massachusetts. Until this year, I celebrated every Rosh Hashanah the same way I had the one before. To spend this holiday anywhere but in the long, solemn hours of synagogue would have been unfathomable. Now, without the rules wrapped tightly around me, I no longer know what to do. Dreading the arrival of this year's high holy days, I'd considered pretending they didn't exist and decided to go to Kripalu only because yoga and meditation seemed to be the obligatory way of moving on. I assume you're doing yoga, an acquaintance said upon hearing the news of my divorce. I've told few people where I'm going for the holiday because to do so would be to admit that I'm no longer Orthodox, something I'm still unsure of myself. Kripalu is 3 hours from my house in the Boston suburb of Newton. a highway drive that, until recently, would have been impossible for me unless I'd studied the maps in search of easy back roads and plotted a route that felt sufficiently safe. For almost a decade of living in the Boston area, I've been gripped by a fear of driving, steadfastly avoiding rotaries, bridges, and tunnels, terrified of getting lost, most of all, terrified of the highway. I couldn't bear the sight of those green signs announcing the Mass Pike or I-95. I had nightmares of making a wrong turn onto a wrong street that would lead me to an entry ramp that would take me onto a highway from which I'd never find my way back. Yet I'm now on the Mass Pike. The cars are passing me, too many and too fast. And still shocked that I'm driving on the highway, I clutch the steering wheel, worried about getting into an accident. The biggest fear, though, is not of any injury I might sustain, but of the fact that then people will know I'd planned to spend Rosh Hashanah at some suspect retreat center instead of praying in synagogue for a year of blessing, a year of goodness. At the start of all other years, I knew exactly what sort of goodness I was supposed to be praying for. But on this new year, there's no ready prayer, even if I could bring myself to utter one. It's not just where I'm going for the holiday, but when. I'd left too late, and now the sun is setting, and the clock on my dashboard reminds me how close it is to the deadline of exactly 6:08 p.m. that until recently would have divided my day into unalterable domains of allowed and forbidden. It still feels impossible that I could break any of the rules. Every transgression feels like a first, each one new and destabilizing. I speed up. Better to break the laws of Massachusetts than the laws of religion that are still binding in my head. If I go faster, maybe I can make it to Kripalu before driving becomes forbidden. But the sun is sinking, and no matter how fast I go, I won't arrive before Rosh Hashanah begins. The only option now, in accordance with Jewish law, would be to pull over by the side of the road, knock on someone's door, and ask to stay for the next 48 hours, as though I were a hiker stranded in an unexpected blizzard. If this were a Jewish fairy tale of the sort I'd been raised on, I'd wander in the forest of central Massachusetts until in a clearing, with just minutes until the holiday began, I'd come upon a small cabin bathed in golden light, and inside, lo and behold, a nice Jewish couple, probably childless, with the holiday candles ready to be lit, an extra place at their table waiting just for me. I keep going, watching the dashboard clock as the numbers change to 6:08. Finally, I've traversed the line that divides me from my past. The drivers around me, shouldn't they have the same look of fear on their faces, distressed at finding themselves in their cars at this hour on this day? Even though I'm in my getaway car, every action is recorded, every word, every thought known and evaluated. The voices that have been speaking in a whisper this entire drive are now thundering. If you veer this far, you will never be found. If you leave the path, you will be cut off and alone. My iPhone, my trusty companion, might be ably guiding me toward my destination, but there are other ways to get lost. I've driven not just into western Massachusetts, but into the outermost region of who I was supposed to be. I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
Hi.
Hi.
The book is so, that was a great introduction to the tone of the book, which is so lyrical and so often funny and really moving. And it's really a book about a journey. I wondered, as somebody who's a novelist primarily, how was the act of writing a memoir, and how do you decide how much and what to share?
I always thought I could never possibly write a memoir. Just the idea of writing nonfiction always felt so scary because, part of the pleasure of writing fiction is that sense of invention, that you might start with things that are close to home. Certainly Ladies Auxiliary, my first book, began with my upbringing in a small Jewish community, but the pleasure of it is that you change things and that you get to add things and you get to look from different perspectives. And a memoir in so many ways is more constraining. You're only coming from your perspective, and you can't change what happens. You can't change the plot. You can't add in characters. And so I think I approached it really with a tremendous amount of anxiety. Usually it began with, why am I writing a memoir? Why am I not writing another novel? And this, even the word memoir was so anxiety producing, because there is that sense of exposure, of self-exposure and a world around you, of exposing the people close to you. And so I really wrestled, and maybe sometimes still do, with that question of what does it mean to tell a true story, and what are the gains of it, and what are the losses both creatively and personally in doing it. But I think I came back to that idea that I wanted to be able to write without that distancing sense of fiction of it is me, it's not me, that almost mask you can put on, and to sort of to own my story and to say this is my story, and it's hard to write about it and it feels complicated, but I do feel like that willingness to be honest is what enables people to own their own stories and to be honest. And I feel like so often we sort of go to battle with our I'm fine, you're all fine, I'm sure everyone here is always fine, that sense that we can't tell hard things. And I think there's a relief that comes when you are willing to tell those hard stories.
I mean, I think that's why these people were reaching out to you in this. I mean, I'm sure people felt the same way with great love of your novels, but this notion of this woman who may be so different from me is telling her story, and it makes me feel connected to my story.
Right, and I think also it's so easy to feel you're the only one who feels a certain way, that I am the only one who has this experience. And certainly I think the experience of doubt within a community is an extremely lonely experience to have. And so I think the feeling that someone has written something that I might think, or that relates to something I might think, I think is the power of memoir as a form. I think it is why people sometimes gravitate towards wanting a true story, wanting to know, what is life, not just how we present it, but what does it actually feel like for people? What is that messy, complicated spaces inside all of us? What does it feel like to be other people?
Right. The trouble is, truth is slippery, and different people have different truths. And I think one thing people don't understand about memoir compared to fiction is that memoir is still crafted. Memoir is still an art form. It's not a diary, it's not a journal. And, I would imagine that would be both, terrifying and freeing for you, but also that it makes people feel like they're entitled to all your story, and they feel like it's all there, it's all for me. I can ask whatever I want.
Right, and when you put your story out there, you do open up that personal conversation. I do think memoir is a crafted story. It is not, I don't even keep a journal, but if I did, it's not, sort of my diary. It's not every single thing that happens. You're always shaping a story, and I guess we all do that when we tell a story about something that happened yesterday. We're, whether deliberately or unconsciously, making choices about what we include and what we don't include, and what is important. Or I think so much of it is also, well, what lens am I going to look at this through? I really felt that this was primarily a book about religion, about religious struggle. It is a story also about divorce and marriage, but I didn't feel like that was the central lens through which I was entering the book. And so that affects it too. What's important in the book? What do I choose to keep out? I also think that life is far more repetitive than a story. The number of times my editor would write, "We already know this. You have said this 100 times." Enough inside your head of should I, shouldn't I don't know. That there's a shape to a book where sometimes the way life repeats itself is moved out of it. And so I think it takes on a shape. And there were times in writing it, I tried to think of it as a novel. And I feel like, we talk about truth, I always do little quotes, because it's the truth as best I experienced it and I remembered it, with a full awareness that other people will view the same events in different ways, and not even in a malicious way, not saying you made that up, but, oh, I saw that so differently, or my mother saying, are you sure that was that year? I thought that happened when you were older, and the way we can all come at things differently. And so I think my obligation as a writer is to come at it with to the best of my ability, with an honest, open heart to what I'm trying to do, but to recognize, of course, we all have different perspectives on things, and to know that in writing it.
When you're writing about your life, it's never just your life. There are other lives. And I wondered, given that your family is a big part of this story, how much did you give your kids veto power? Were they interested in reading it?
Right. There's family, there's friends, and there's children. And so I think for each of them I had a different sort of way of approaching it, but I was always extremely aware of what it meant to write about real people. It's one thing in a novel to feel like, Mom, do you mind if I base this character on you and then, go in a different direction? It's another thing to be like, oh, so I'm writing about you. I'm writing about these experiences. And so I think that there is, I think in writing it, I was so aware of the power that needed to be wielded with care and compassion. And I think maybe, I thought about this so much as I wrote. It was something that I arrived at in the various drafts I wrote of the book, realizing maybe it's something I learned most as a novelist, that the best books, the books I want to read, the books I want to write, don't have, the good guys and the bad guys. It's not black and white, that all people come with their complications, and that I wanted to write in the same way when I'm creating characters. I want to feel compassionate towards all of them, even ones who I might not want to be like or might not always admire every moment, but to bring this sense of empathy and compassion to all characters. And so that was really important to me in writing a memoir, to have a sense, to write not from anger, certainly not to write from any kind of sense of vengeance or settling of scores. I think, not only would I feel like that would be irresponsible, it would be the worst kind of writing. Those sort of moments of like, oh, I'm going to go after this person here. Those are always your smallest moments. And I think memoir, any writing benefits from writing from the most expansive places. And the other thing I thought a lot about in writing was the question of whose story is this? Who does this story belong to? And I felt like I was choosing to write my own story. And of course, other people populate our stories. There's no way around it when we live in family and in communities. But I was very aware of certain stories I felt like did not belong to me. They belonged to family members or to other people in the book. And I felt like there were moments when I knew that if I were writing as a novel, I would say, oh, this would be really interesting. Let's open this wide or tease this out. And there were places in the book where I felt like, we're just going to move right along. I know where they are. I hope the readers don't always know where they are. But that sense that this story does not belong to me, I'm going to choose to sort of skirt along its edges. And certainly with children. There I felt the greatest sense. The only one who wants to read it is my 10-year-old daughter. My middle son has read parts of it, the parts that are about him. A piece that was an essay about taking him for a piece of not kosher pizza was in the New York Times and Modern Love a few months ago. And so before I sent that to Modern Love, he read it and he was fine with it, and we read it together when it came out. And he sort of enjoyed he's like, I'm known as the pizza kid. So he sort of has enjoyed that kind of, moment in it. But I did feel with children the greatest sense of protectiveness, and that I wasn't going to write anything that they were uncomfortable with it anyway.
Yeah. One of the things I really admired about the book was, you've sketched these, broad strokes, but yet so specific and comprehensible pictures of these children. Particularly, I loved the pizza scene because that was so much clearly about you and this moment that you and he were sharing, and the import of it was so clear to both of you. But then thinking about the pizza scene made me start thinking about the food is a big deal in other places in this book too, like learning your grandmother's kosher for Passover mayonnaise recipe. What is it with the resonance of food and identity,
Right,
and family?
It's funny how food does play a big role. I remember when I wrote The Ladies' Auxiliary, I felt like everyone was always cooking. Someone pointed out like a list of all the different foods everyone was making. And it was very much a part of my childhood and a part of spending time with my mother in the kitchen and cooking with her, and cooking with my father now as well. I guess food is certainly in the Jewish world. Food is such an intersection, not just about love, but about laws. And I think that maybe is why it mattered so much. And I think about the scene where, the piece I wrote about that was in Modern Love was my middle son, who was very sort of frustrated with feeling like he was made to observe things and sort of very uninterested in a lot of things. Asking me on a number of occasions, what I believed in, and sort of usually like at 10:30 at night when I was trying to sort of wrap up bedtime for the night, those deep searching questions. And I think one of the things I really ask myself a lot is, how do you be authentic with children? How do you both respect the fact that they're young and yet still bring your authentic self to them, still not give answers that really don't express who you are in any way? And we had sort of a series of these conversations, and he once said to me, have you ever had, non-kosher, like non-hechshered pizza? And it was one of those moments where I felt like, do I pretend to my child, or do I tell him the truth? And eventually I did
It's
tell
the Orthodox equivalent of the drug talk.
Right, exactly.
Did you ever
This was-
inhale?
he's like, Mom, can I ask you a question? And I was like, oh God, what is this going to be? And, but that it loomed very large for him. And after much wrestling and sort of much figuring out how this was going to work, I ended up taking him to a pizza place near our house, and I said, you can only get vegetarian, that we can just have cheese pizza, because I, felt like I wasn't, it was a misdemeanor, it wasn't, a full felony, and I was sort of,
Because the place didn't have, there were no unkosher ingredients on the pizza, but it didn't have a hechsher.
Right, so for me, for my Orthodox world, I realized that I consider that non-kosher pizza. For many people, they're like, how can cheese pizza be non-kosher? But in my world, that was not kosher. And I was sort of explaining we can only have vegetarian, and I'm a vegetarian, so it was a very clear line, and he accepted that. But I watched him sort of eye this case of all the different pizzas, and he turned to me and he said, Mom, if one day when I'm older, if I decide to eat pizza with meat on it, will you still love me? And I just feel like that's the question, right? If I am not like you, if I don't accept your boundary, if I make my own boundaries, if I come at it completely differently, do you still love who I am? And I think food becomes a way to think about love and acceptance. And certainly, for me, that question crystallized so many of what I was interested in exploring in the book, of how, both as a child and as a mother, how do we give our children room to become themselves? How do we become that as adults? How do we still maintain a sense of connection and closeness to people who believe differently? Do religious divides mean that we cut off from people who don't see the world as we do? And something with parenting, as the mother of young children, I used to think the hardest part was holding on tight when they're running circles around me, but as the mother of older children, I know the hardest part is letting go, is letting them become themselves. And I think for me that moment was one of those moments of realizing that there are no simple answers in how we let our children become themselves.
Your older son was very drawn to the rules of Orthodoxy, and that must have been an interesting time, having both of them together and having, can you tell the refrigerator light story?
Right. As much as I wanted to give my middle child permission to explore and to bring my own authentic self, I feel like that permission extends in all directions. It's not just the ones who might match us, but to realize that for my older child, that he considered himself Orthodox, and I felt like my job was to enable that for him and to help him be who he wanted to be at that time, and to still value that for him and to pave that path for him. And so there's a scene in the book where, he asked me to unscrew the light in the refrigerator because if you open it on Shabbat, it would be breaking one of the laws of Shabbat. And so I think it becomes a moment of reflecting on how that wasn't my rule or my sense of transgression, but we can still choose to accommodate people who believe differently and to create that sense of a wide family. And it's not always simple. It comes with complications. And, a lot of people have asked me, well, do you always have to accommodate if it's only accommodating in one direction? And where are the edges of accommodation? And where are the lines? It's complicated. But I guess the question I always have in response is, what is the other alternative? Do you cut off from people not different? We have no choice but to live and love people who do not believe the same things as we do. And I think the question becomes, how do we best do that? And, I guess in the book, one of the things that I valued most in those hard moments was the coming to recognize the need to have the hard conversations, not just with children, but with any of those people we love, to be willing to have those moments of saying, I don't believe this, and you do, and how do we stay connected? How do we still have that sense of closeness?
I was looking for the quote that I wrote down that seemed like, being about sort of remaking both Judaism and family in a way that was comfortable for you, and a way that you could sort of be with your kids and be in the world. And is that still an ongoing process? Sort of what Jewishness is for you now?
I mean, I think that being part of an Orthodox world, it wasn't just sort of a sense of this sort of, oh, I'm also Orthodox as part of me. I felt like it was the most central part of who I was, really that central piece of my identity. And so to no longer be that really required a reshaping. And, I think often about, the various separations we make. And I very soon after I started telling people I wasn't Orthodox, someone said, okay, are you conservative now? Are you Reform? And I was like, I don't even know. I don't know what that even means. And I think that in any leave-taking, there's that space between spaces, that sort of like desert place between two places of becoming, first unbecoming before you can become. And, certainly in the book and in my own life, I was really interested in exploring those places of uncertainty. I felt like I lived in a world where there was a very strong sense of certainty and shared identity, and this is what we do and what we don't do, and this is who you are, this sense of belonging, which is double-edged. It comes with its beautiful parts and its complicated parts. And so I feel like to leave that is to live in this uncertain place between them. And I feel like in any leave-taking, it's important to be willing to stay in that space, even when it's uncomfortable, because it is sometimes that sense of, I don't know what I believe, or I don't know what my Jewish world looks like. And I think very much, sort of in the years following the book, or maybe towards the end of the book, the question becomes, can you leave something but not leave all of it? Can you decide that I want to leave a piece of it and yet still hold on to the parts that are important to me? And I do think leaving leaves a scar behind. It's not sort of like you launch in without that awareness of what used to be, but I also don't want to lose all of it because of that sense of the pain of leaving. And so it's in process, I would say.
There was a lovely scene of you making Hamantaschen with the kids and just figuring out, sort of early on, oh, this is a thing that I want to keep and that I want to have. And the family of it was, and the ritual of it was in its own way super meaningful.
Right, at first I had this anxiety, oh no, Hamantaschen, I can't do that, I'm not Orthodox anymore. And then recognizing you can recraft a Jewish identity that is separate from that you can still participate and partake without it threatening a sense of what you have left. And it's hard because I think when you leave, it's so easy to feel, it comes with a sense of embattlement. I think you have to fight your way to leave something that has shaped you, whether it's an external fighting or an internal fighting. And so those moments like making Hamantaschen do threaten that sense. There is that surge of worry, but I think, what I have chosen for myself is that I still do feel connected, and it's different. It's not the way it used to be. It's not a recreation of it, and it comes with inconsistencies or uncertainties or things that are just new and freeing also at the same time, but it's trying to decide what still does matter to me.
Like one thing that I thought was so, the first act of separation, it's necessarily solo. It's you and your soul and internal, and you're the one who makes the decision to leave. And the thing that I thought that I really liked was at Kripalu, you doing your own version of tashlich, when you throw your sins into the water at somebody's private lake or something, water supply. It is unclear how a raisin challah from the kosher bakery in Newton would be viewed floating in the water. Right. So instead, I find a few sticks to toss in, my symbolic sins. As I watch them sink, I say the general confession prayer. Ashamnu, bagadnu, gazalnu. We have sinned, we have transgressed, we have stolen, we have rebelled, we have scoffed. Not only is guilt communal, but so is penance. No lonely I, but a scripted eternal we. All other years, I said these plural words in synagogue, and as alone and disconnected as I might have felt, I was always surrounded by a congregation of others, without giving much thought to their meaning. I had recited words that cast me as part of a group. Now it strikes me how alone I am and how unaccustomed I am to this. I realize that I have a fear of being alone. Is this, I wonder, why we pray in the communal voice, for fear of who we are on our own? And I wondered what you could say about sort of the difference between aloneness and loneliness and how you struggle with I and we now.
Right, it's very, I feel like there's quite the question of I and we. And, when Judy read a bit of Ladies Auxiliary, I guess I started writing it 20 years ago. I was like, oh, is that how it begins? Like, who knew? The sense of, but, Ladies Auxiliary is told from this communal narrator. It's not something we would have done. And, I think from, really very early on in my writing, I've been interested in that relationship between the community and the individual, and the question of what is the pleasure of belonging to a group, of feeling like this is where I belong, I'm one of this group. And then what is also, I think there's a loneliness in that as well if you don't feel you match, or what happens when you feel you have to shave off the parts of your individuality in order to gain that sense of belonging. And I think for so many people who leave religious worlds, there is that trade-off between community and belonging and individual freedom. And I think that every freedom comes with loss. And, in many ways, I felt like the book or the experience of this year that I was writing about was about asking, what does it mean to be willing to live with your own voice? It was much easier in a certain way to follow the world I had been raised in, to know that this is who I had been raised to be, and this was the set of expectations. And I was always a rule follower. I did what I was supposed to do. And there is comfort in that, and a sense of matching the world around you. I think the problem comes when you privately do not experience yourself as actually belonging, when it's an external belonging, but your own sense of doubt or grappling or questions cannot be voiced within that community. And I think, ultimately what I felt like was that is really the loneliest position to be in. That sense that if I were to be my true self, I could not be among people who love me. I could not fit if I were to actually be who I am. And so I think that tension, though, I think is present in the book, and still is a tension for me, that sense of connection versus individuality and how you navigate each of them. And I think also the willingness to be your true self, to speak in your own voice, comes at a risk. We take a risk when we say who we actually are, when we say things that go against a set of communal norms. And sometimes it's the price we pay for being our own selves.
One of the things that I thought about in the book was, you have a brother who is ultra, can I say ultra Orthodox? Okay.
Yeah.
I'm never sure what words are okay. Ultra Orthodox. And, there's you, there's your sister who got married at 37. And one thing I thought was really, you said that your parents used to write roots to grow and wings to soar on all of the birthday and graduation cards. And I wonder, how are your parents with all of this, diversity within the family? And surely, I guess no parent knows what they're signing up for at any point, but...
Right, we never know. My middle son is very into sports and sees everything as a sports statistic. And so a few years ago, I was sort of describing for him the differences in our family. And I said, your uncle is like this, and I'm like this, and I said, your aunt is very similar to my parents. And so he thought about it. He goes, oh, I guess my grandparents must feel like they're 1 for 3, in terms of their kids. I told my father this story, and he's like, no, we're 3 for 3, which was to his credit. And so, I think it's the craziness for all of us of parenting, that sense, when you're young. I remember being so worried about every move they made, and if we went outside when it was this cold, and having young children, this fantasy. I think it's nothing more than a fantasy that you have control over who they will become. And part of kids getting older is recognizing the fact that you can teach them and you can show them what's important to you and you can raise them a certain way. But ultimately, they become their own people. They are entitled to choose their own beliefs. And it's painful. It's a painful process to watch children choose something other than what we might choose for them. But someone said, well, what would you let your child, your adult child do this? And I was like, do I have that control? And I think you can recognize both the pain of knowing your children can make other choices and yet create space for them. And sometimes it requires, I think, changing that image we have, that sort of version of who we imagine they're going to be, to let them become themselves. And I feel like I've learned that as a parent through my own parents who really have done that. I think certainly when your 40-year-old daughter calls you and says, hi guys, so I'm gonna get divorced, and I'm not gonna be Orthodox anymore, those conversations, where you're like, how is this shifting who I imagine my daughter is and who she is saying she is now? And having a son who lives in Sfat and is part of a Breslover Hasidic community, that is also a shift from that vision. But I think that they have navigated it by accepting the fact that this is who their children are and that the family love is more important than any version of who we were somehow supposed to be.
Yeah. One of the reviews of this book called it the devout person's version of coming out. And I thought that was interesting. that it sort of went with the line about, being in a community that doesn't tolerate difference very well, and observing the rules of that community means being good, and that means you're loved. And if the world is so you could say that if the world's spinning were halted for one moment and a finger placed on one small spot, you could say, I belong here. And I wonder just about learning rules as a grown-up, and, are there rules? Do you make all the rules? Are there some rules? How does it work? And do you feel like coming out is a good, most people come out a lot younger than 40.
Right, I do feel like that, I'm not reading any reviews somehow. I managed to be very disciplined with that, but I appreciate hearing that, because I do think that there are so many parallels. And I guess, one of the things I'm happy about is the sense that any individual story can be universal, that it can translate to many different kinds of worlds. But I feel like, it is a question of difference. That the idea of belonging, to be able to say, put your finger on a spot and say, I belong here. I think the question that you have to ask is, well, who gets to say that? Who gets to belong? And what are the rules of belonging? And what if you don't match that notion? Are you still allowed to belong, or are you other in that world? And so I think that, for me, the question of rules was really very much what I struggled with, because it wasn't just sort of a generalized belonging or going to shul, once a week and sort of a nominal participation, but rules that were not just something I did every day, but that were stamped on your body. I mean, there are very bodily rules, especially for women, in terms of dress, in terms of the laws of mikveh. They're not external, they are part of your being. And so to observe them when you feel, I don't want this, or I don't believe it. And I think, a lot of times it's easy to talk about belonging, but belief matters too. Do you actually believe this? And I think for me, that question was one I always wanted to put aside, because I didn't really want to deal with it. But I think it matters. It's a crucial question of, do I believe it's true? And so I think that when you are asking that question and yet still doing so many rules at every moment, I think that's where you have that sense of intersection, or the sense of a private identity hitting up against a public version of who you are pretending to be.
I mean, this is a little bit from the sublime to the ridiculous, but while we're talking about body autonomy, one of my favorite scenes in this book is the impossible search for a sheitel, that she's got this crazy curly hair, and there was no way to match it. I wondered, and then there's another scene in the mikveh where you can't, I wanted to just talk a little bit about the Jewish hair, the role of hair, and covering the hair.
Sure. We can discuss my hair. Let's discuss hair. It's funny. I do feel like, one of the things that my editor and I joked, my hair was like sort of this motif through the book, or one of the threads that I was going to follow. And, I did think a lot about, what it meant to cover hair. When I got married, when I just turned 23, and it was sort of the norm in my community to cover my hair, even though we were part of a modern Orthodox community, but it was sort of, I imagined that I was very liberal because I was going to wear a fall, which is not a full wig. It would start right here, and you pull your hair over it, and it was this sense. I was like, oh no, I'm not wearing a wig. I'm wearing a fall, and somehow that difference felt enormous to me. But it was this search for hair that would match exactly, which of course was impossible. And
it's hilarious. It's like a scene from a screwball comedy.
Right. And yet, of course, it was true. It actually was true. This sense of going from wig maker to wig. And I think the deeper question was, in getting married, would I still look like myself? There was something, as someone who's also always hated my curly hair, there was sort of the appeal of oh, you can have straight hair, you can be someone else, but that question of, do you have to lose your identity? Do you have to lose who you are? And I think the hair, and certainly in the book, became this question of what happens to the parts of you that don't want to be suppressed, or, curls as a metaphor for bad behavior or non-behavior, this sort of non-compliance. And so I did like writing about it. It was sort of fun for me to write about it. Although, it's funny, the reason I stopped reading reviews of the book, a very early review referred to my unruly curls. And I was like, you know what, I'm done. I just cannot read this. It's too personal to read your hair reviewed in a magazine.
I mean, it's also funny because it makes me think of this whole history of Jewish hair as this symbol of, wild sexuality and, tackiness and not being able to be constrained. Right. And then you had the Mikveh Lady who, that was one of your early moments of
Right.
rebellion, right?
But I was, when I was sort of mapping the book out, I made these note cards on the floor. I would sort of arrange this big elaborate note card thing across the living room floor until, no one could walk there. And, I was just sort of like, well, what, I am very in touch with like the ruminating. My editor was like, we could write, I thought, for hundreds of pages. But, one of the things in a book is to say, well, what did I do? What is the relationship between thought and action? And so I really spent a lot of time thinking about those moments. And the mikveh was one of those moments. This sense, again, where it's so body oriented, it's so personal. It's not, it's not laws that live in books or live somewhere else, but they are on the most private parts of your body. And that sense of, so there's a moment when a woman, the Mikveh Lady, the attendant, asked me if I could comb my hair better. And, I'm usually very compliant and would sort of go and do what was said. And I remember it was sort of this moment of this like rising sense of no, like, which took me by surprise, this awareness that, no, I could not. And those moments, I think, when maybe you take yourself by surprise, but it always felt like this small, hard place inside me that just couldn't do it anymore. And I think eventually those moments sort of built and became something larger. But that was, those moments about, hair covering. I think also this sense of, could I cover who I was? Could I put this piece of myself away when I didn't believe in it? I think that the belief part there matters immensely, because if you believe it is true and you believe it is a divine command or the word of God, then maybe you do it even if you don't like it. But if you don't believe that and you do it, then I think is when it becomes much more problematic.
One of your other sort of action moments of rebellion, which, I never thought a scene in which someone goes to the bathroom and checks her phone on a toilet could be as incredibly fraught and dramatic. And, do you want to tell that story?
Right. Well, I think a lot about what are those moments of transgression. And, transgression often can take place in your head. I think those moments are very important when you may not act, but you quietly say to yourself, like, no, or I'm not this, that quiet sense of knowing. But I think one of the things that, and I lived with that quiet sense of knowing for a long time. But I think, the larger question becomes, well, what do you do about it? Do you continue to live with the sense that there's a private self inside me who will always remain that way, but will never become a public or outer self? But I guess one of the first real moments of transgression for me was checking my phone on Shabbat. And so on one hand, it's like a silly transgression. Like, I'm sure there are many people who observe Shabbat who know the trick of like sneaking into the bathroom just to like check email very quickly. But for me, it was that moment of saying that it wasn't just something I thought, but I was actually going to act on it. And I think that, I think part of what is sometimes hard about writing about observance or writing about orthodoxy is that there's the presumption that the details don't matter. I did an interview, an NPR interview earlier this year where someone sort of laughed about like, oh, and then the girls in your book, they wore jeans. Oh, aren't they so radical? And I was like, no, but that is the point. Like, it is radical. It might not outwardly appear that way, but when the rules matter immensely, and when you are taught that being good rests on your observing this rule, or that your belonging requires you to do this, then those small transgressions change your whole world. And so a moment of, checking my phone on Shabbat, on one hand I feel like, oh great, my big transgression came while hiding in the bathroom. Like how bold or courageous is that? But that sense, that moment of saying, it's not just what I think, but I'm acting on it. I'm able to break this rule and to feel comfortable with that.
That reminds me of one of the lines that I underlined that I thought was so, when you were struggling to be good and followed the rules, but knew you were full of questions when you were very young. And, I guess this was when you were in Israel I think this was when you were in Israel in school, and you said that you were going to stop touching boys even casually. You were going to stop wearing jeans. And the line is, I would not pick and choose which laws I would observe. Each rule was a load-bearing wall in the overarching structure. Here at last was the promise of goodness. And that was so...
I thought so much in the book about, the idea of what does it mean to be good. I feel like my parents, when they named me Tova, could not have imagined how complicated that name would be, which means Tova, which means, Tova meaning good. That question of, what does it mean to be good? And I was certainly raised from a very young age with the idea of observance was the same thing as goodness, that if you observed, you were good, and if you were good, you were loved. And I think part of leaving that world is what happens to the idea of goodness, what happens to good. And part of it, I think, is to break down that dichotomy of, you're good or you're bad, you were one or the other, and to sort of reshape that question. But I think that those early lessons have such a powerful hold, that question of, can you be good if you do not observe? Can you be good if you do not match this sort of good girl version of who you were supposed to be? And I think ultimately, in many ways, it's a letting go of that word, of letting go of the idea that there is a good way to be and a bad way, and sort of trying to broaden the question as opposed to just the answer to that.
I think if you have a card with your question on it, you can feel free to, there are people going around to collect them. Okay, my next question is an entirely selfish question, which is, I wondered, you've remarried. I wondered if you've learned to fight better in your second, that there was a lot of under the surface, right. Your first husband didn't have the struggles and questions about faith that you and goodness and that you did. Can you teach us anything about how to fight well?
Right. I feel like maybe it's one of the most important parts of being married is how to fight well. And I think that, for me, when I was younger, conflict was enormously scary. There was a sense that if we talk about it, there's a problem. So best not to talk about it. And then somehow magically there's no problem, which of course is not true. And I do, I think maybe one of the ironies that the book the end of the book sort of touches on is that I am remarried, and we do have religious differences. My husband he calls himself, Jewish. He is a secular Jew who was raised, really outside of any kind of religious world, but with a strong sense of sort of cultural Jewish identity. And we do have to, figure out how do we map our different families, our extended families, our children being raised differently. And, maybe it is that question of how do you both, in any marriage, how do you be your own self and make room for someone else to be themselves and yet still find that sense of connection? And so, I do feel like it's sort of funny. I feel like, oh, you wanted someone not religious? Here you go. You got that. And so maybe we always get the opposite. We get sometimes what we ask for, but then we have to ask what we need from that. And so I do think it's a question of how do I am much more Jewishly involved than my husband is, and I want a stronger sense of Jewish engagement and Jewish communal activity than he does. And so some of it is saying that I can do it by myself. I don't need to be someone who drags a person to shul on Simchat Torah because I want to go. I don't want to be the dragger to shul. And I can go on my own. And some of it is recognizing, when do I not want to go by myself? When do I want you to be part of this with me, even if I know you don't want to be part of it? And that sense of compromise and working it out. And, certainly there are moments, I think about, my husband has 3 children, and, we had, to use as an example, we had Thanksgiving this past year with, an extended family, everyone in very different places, significant others who are not Jewish, my children, my parents, my sister, and this sort of question of this is an American Jewish family with all of its combinations and all of its complications, and this is who we are around the table. And even though there were moments I felt like, I think I'm going to go upstairs and lie down for a few moments because it is complicated and it is sometimes tiring, it is still my family. And so I accept when it is imperfect, when I decide to feel like, oh, I don't know what to do here, or how do I have that conversation? But most of all, how do I maintain that sense of a connection to these people?
Okay. So I'm going to start looking through these. And Judy, do you want to ask a question while I'm sort of sorting here?
Screening out.
Yeah, screening. You can take mine.
A placeholder.
Okay.
A placeholder question.
While she's getting ready. So I'd like to know if you could talk about
I'll repeat this.
one of the more interesting or unexpected questions or feedback that you got from not necessarily someone in the Jewish community who saw something in your book that they related to as well.
She wondered, were there any interesting questions or feedback from somebody not necessarily in the Jewish community who responded to the stories in the book?
Yeah. I've had a really fascinating experience the past few months with the Mormon community. And I knew that the Ladies Auxiliary was somehow read in the Mormon world. My mother told me about a website that was started by a Mormon community that talked about the book. And I guess there's a moment in the Ladies Auxiliary when someone who was sitting in this audience, I will say, told me a story about a friend of a friend who kept a secret stash of shrimp salad in her freezer and didn't tell anyone about it, and she felt like it was sort of her private thing. And I thought it was funny. I didn't know if it was true or not, and I put it in the book. And it's sort of, for me, it felt like this metaphorical thing about how we all have our private shrimp salad stashed away. And so this Mormon
Shrimp salad of the soul.
Exactly, we all have it. And so this Mormon website asked people to write in their own shrimp salad. And so it was sort of this interesting thing. I knew the book was sort of read in the Mormon world. And then when this memoir came out, I was asked to do this podcast called Mormon Stories. And I was like, okay, this should be interesting. And so I did it. I talked about the book. And somehow it became this thing in the Mormon community. It was viewed by 10,000 people, and I started getting mail from people who were struggling with Mormonism or leaving it, or part of the progressive wing of Mormonism. And it was, I think if anything, it has been the part of this experience of putting this book out in the world that has fascinated me the most. And, this sense of people saying this story feels so close to home. This feels so much like my struggle of what would it mean to leave this world? Or what does it mean to say, like, one woman wrote to me and said, I didn't realize that other people felt that they had the sole truth. I thought only we felt that way. Or I'm afraid of what it means to leave. And I think for me, that has been the most gratifying experience. I'm doing an event for this Mormon podcast in Salt Lake City in 2 weeks. And so I think it's that moment of realizing that the story, on one hand, it feels so crazily personal to me, but it's a larger story about leave-taking. And I think that so many people navigate separations, whether it's religious separations or family separations, or maybe separations from our own sense of identity, of who we feel we're supposed to be. And so I think that really, more than anything, has been the part that, if I knew that the book would be probably selling more copies in the Mormon world than anywhere else, I would not have believed it if you told me that.
Okay, so there's some really great questions here. I don't think we're going to get to all of them, but we'll take a crack at it. This one is, what is your reaction to and relationship with the many Haredi authors like Shalom Deen who have left the derech, who've left Orthodoxy?
Right. It's interesting. There are a number of wonderful memoirs about leaving the ultra-Orthodox world. And I always read them. I read them primarily as a member of the modern Orthodox community. And so there was a sense of both identification with their stories and yet a feeling like, I'm part of a different part of the community. And, I think in many ways my book bears a lot in common with those. It's about leave-taking, about reshaping identity, about what does it mean to be outside of the sense of structure. I think that to leave from the modern Orthodox world is very different. I think it's easier in a lot of ways because there's not this sense of being separate from the secular world and then entering it. I think, really one of the hallmarks of modern Orthodoxy is the idea that you are part of the secular world even as you maintain your particular religious identity, in the sense that you can be both at once. You can be both modern and traditional. You can somehow, even if it's an imperfect marriage, you can marry together these two worlds. And so I think maybe the particular experience of modern Orthodoxy that's different is, what does it feel like to live in both worlds? Not to be separate from it, but to feel that somehow I can hold together these competing worlds and not have them overtake me. And so I feel a kinship to those writers, in a sense also of, I think one of the things that I feel most grateful towards my own family, and the thing that makes me most angry about the experience in general is the way in which people lose contact with family members, particularly with children. I feel the sense of travesty that occurs when children are estranged from parents or vice versa over religious issues. I just feel like, in whose name, in what sense of God or meaning or purpose do we cut children off from parents?
I'm debating reading this one. That seems to come out of that one. But as an adult, generally in the Orthodox community, I can't imagine not going to weddings of friends who marry non-Jews. It feels like a slap in the face to those who love me. How do you feel that the Orthodox community currently deals with these realities? What about your ultra-Orthodox brother?
In terms of how they do. I think, people have asked me a lot how the book has been read in the Orthodox world, or if I feel like there's a message to Orthodox world. And I think I think what I would want to say to that world, which in some ways is my world, it's, it doesn't stop being your own world, is how do you deal with difference? How do you deal with the fact that no one gets to choose who their children become? We don't get to decide it for them. We never know what our children are going to, we never know what issue we're going to deal with. When I think about my children, completely separate from religious issues. if you told me that this would be something you would know a lot about, how would I have known that before this particular child was born? And so, I think obviously the question of intermarriage is a hard one, but I think to come at it and say, I will, my child would never happen to me. I think maybe the first important step is to realize it is all of us. It's not someone else's issue. It is all of ours. It is all of our children's. And to come at it with a sense of, I personally would always place love above ideology. I would place a sense of love and connection to a person beyond any need to uphold a belief. I understand people would view it differently, but I think that the walls that are drawn in our world about any kind of difference are so damaging and cut so deep towards people. And so, and I did an event recently where someone, it was for a group of women in the Jewish community, and someone raised her hand and said, I can hardly say this, but my daughter is an evangelical Christian. What should I do? What am I supposed to tell her? She can't be that? And I was like, exactly, that is your daughter. Are you happy about it? Does someone else have to be happy about it? It's not really the question of are you happy about it. It's this is your daughter and this is how it's sort of shaken out. What are your choices? What do you do with this?
Somebody wanted to know how leaving the Orthodox community impacted your friendships there.
I think the way it impacted my friendships was one of the parts that was the hardest and most surprising, although maybe it shouldn't have been. I felt like a divorce, and certainly one that had the sort of the component of leaving Orthodoxy, was not a private matter, but was regarded sort of in public terms. And so I really found, very early on, what it means to walk into the grocery store and have people not say hello. I feel like I could write a dissertation on the hi kind of look that you get when people are not, officially not speaking to you. And I think back on all the times maybe when I didn't say hi to someone when I should have, or I didn't see someone, or I didn't stop. And I think we don't say hello for lots of reasons. Sometimes it's because we're in our own world. Sometimes it's because we want to register our disapproval. We want to make it known that I can't stop you from doing this, but I don't like it, and the only way I can do it is by not saying hello. I think sometimes it's because we don't recognize how when you feel vulnerable, and certainly divorce makes you feel like you don't even know where you belong anymore, like nothing is solid. I think when you're not in that position, it's so hard to know how much a hello matters in those moments, how the easiest of gesture, the smile, how enormously meaningful it can be to the person who feels vulnerable. And so I felt, for all those reasons, I think people did not say hello. There was a sense that the story was uncomfortable, it was threatening, people don't know what to say in a divorce, they don't want to take sides, they do want to take sides, sort of for all those reasons. But I think it did contribute to a sense of loneliness or a sense of being cast out. And, maybe the flip side of it, I think that, it taught me really the value of the hello also. It taught me that sense that, I recently heard about a friend of, someone I haven't talked to in years who was getting divorced. My first thought was, I shouldn't email, I shouldn't intrude. And I realized you should always email. You should always do that how much those small gestures mean to people.
I also wonder if the not saying hello thing is also, as we talked about, everybody's got their own narrative going on, and what happens in somebody else's life often, makes you think about your own in this, yeah.
Right, we never know what about our stories makes other people anxious. I mean, I know the things that really get me going. They're the ones that touch on my own vulnerable spots, and so those ways in which other people's stories bump up against ours, and we don't always know. Sometimes we have no idea why someone is so bothered by it, but they privately probably know why.
You sort of answered a little bit about the difference between leaving an ultra-Orthodox versus modern Orthodox community. I thought this part was really interesting. Do you think it's more difficult for women versus men?
That's interesting. I don't know. I mean, I don't know.
You've only done it one way.
Right. What do you think? I'm curious to turn the question out. I think each comes with its own particular complications and challenges. I mean, I think, for me, it was so much about the notion of good girl, that idea of what it meant to be, the good wife, the good mother. Good mothers don't do this, good wives don't do this, good girls would never do this. That word had such a sense of mastery over me, or had such a sort of like authoritarian stance over me of what it meant to break that boundary. And so I think that felt particularly gendered. I feel like that sort of felt like a female component to it, of what it meant to break out of that. But I don't know if I could generalize. I'm sure, yeah.
I mean, I can't either, but I wonder if, men are supposed to be explorers and adventurers, and they're not primarily defined by parenthood the way women often are. And I wonder if the perception of other people about not so much your individual journey as a man or a woman leaving Orthodoxy would be different, but that the way other people would respond to you might be different.
Well, I think the way in which you're viewed as a mother is always under question. I always sort of prided myself on being like the mother who made every lunch, packed every school lunch, made every dinner, made every birthday cake, sort of that like mother of our generation, like the all inclusive. I would do everything while writing a book, while traveling. I will do, that sort of crazy message about motherhood. And I felt like in divorce, all of a sudden it comes up for question. All of a sudden you're suspect. And that I thought was, sort of fascinating. And I felt it myself. I felt the need to defend. Like, I'm still doing pickup. I'm still doing drop-off. I am this sort of anxiety around, are you still a good mother?
And I think it feeds into the American anxiety that we all have about being a good mother, because we're constantly being told, no matter how we mother, that we're doing it wrong.
Right. My third novel, Visible City, really is very much about motherhood. I remember I had that constant sense of that, I would read these parenting books, and the only thing I knew for sure was that however I was doing it was certainly the wrong way. Like, I didn't know what the right way was, but I knew that I was wrong, that I didn't sleep train, or my kids drank apple juice. I felt like I was a terrible mother because of that. I didn't know, apple juice was terrible. This sense that you're always doing it wrong. I think we carry those feelings with us so easily, that sense of badness and wrongness.
With my own book, I fought so hard against the I think you saw that I winced when, Judy read it out loud, because the subtitle was like, I don't even know it by heart in my own book. It's like, how to raise, intelligent, empathetic, blah, 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 Jewish children. And I don't want to say that. I feel like we're already under so much pressure. Right. That I just wanted it to be, well, first I wanted it to be called Revenge of the Jewish Mother, and they said absolutely not.
Oh, I like that.
And thank you. And then it, became Mamala Knows Best, which I thought was fine, and I didn't want any subtitle, and no.
Right. I think there's also that sense of like the sort of the perfect image. I certainly had it in my mind this, what it is supposed to look like, what your life is supposed to look like. If you follow the path, I got married young. I got married to someone who knew my family. If we moved to a suburb where our friends lived, if you follow the path, at some point you're going to have this sense of then your children will be this way. And I think one of the things that age and life teaches you is it doesn't look that way. The children are not perfect. They don't have to be. And I think so much of what I was interested in writing about also was that you eventually release that idea of perfection, that image, that sense of family only looks one way, and open up the possibility that it looks lots of ways, and our kids can be imperfect. It is not perfect. It is complicated. There are moments when things feel broken, but that there's also a sense of family and love even with those.
Okay, it looks like we are out of time. I'm sorry. Okay. Some of these were awesome.
Thank you all so much for coming.
And thank you. Yeah.
So I want to thank Tova and Marjorie. What a great conversation. And to just let you all know, there's going to be a reception and a book signing in the Great Hall. And to please take a look at a very small exhibit that we put together about the process of getting a Jewish divorce, of getting the get. The very small exhibit case with 3 archival pieces from the American Jewish Historical Society. So just take a look at that. And thank you again.